Kia ora everybody and good evening. My name's Melanie Thornton. I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. It's a very warm welcome to everybody tonight because of course this is our first public event since the lockdown, and so of course it's very exciting for us all. Before we get started, a little bit of health and safety. Usual practice with any kind of earthquake, duck, cover and hold, and if we have to get out of the building, we'll meet outside of the old government buildings. And again, with a fire drill, we'll wait for a fire warden to help us exit the building and again meet outside. So with that over, we're extremely lucky tonight to have Anna Fifield here because she's normally based in Beijing but has been in New Zealand during the lockdown in Havelock, and she's on her way back to Beijing on Monday, I believe. So we pulled this event together very quickly. Thankfully, she was pretty spontaneous about it, and we were able to create this event tonight, and it's fantastic to have so many of you here out in this rubbish weather outside. North Korea is one of the most secretive nations on earth, led by what we all regard as the unpredictable Kim Jong Un. The Hermit Kingdom is largely sealed off from the rest of the world, but it's a source of fascination for many and its leader a source of much speculation for most. Like many here, perhaps, my only experience of North Korea is through a quirky Netflix series called Crash Landing on You, where the portrayal of North Koreans and their country is somewhat funny, quirky, and perhaps a little bit realistic. But maybe it's none of those things. Anna Fifield, however, has been in North Korea 12 times and written and spoken about North Korea many times and in many different settings. Her book, The Great Successor, The Secret Rise and Rule of Kim Jong Un, was published mid-last year and is one of the few sources of extraordinary knowledge about this mysterious leader. Anna, as we know, is the Beijing Bureau Chief for the Washington Post, responsible for coverage of China. Previously, she was the correspondent for the Financial Times for 13 years, based in London, Sydney, Seoul, Tehran, Beirut, and Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming Anna Fifield tonight to speak to us.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for that very kind introduction, and tēnā koutou katoa, everybody. Thank you for coming to out on this very cold, rainy, typical Wellington night, I've discovered. I was just looking at this here. It makes it look like I've developed a bit of a personality cult of my own, but I flatly deny any attempts to put my own portrait up in Pyongyang. It's really delightful for me to be here tonight. Because I am a graduate of Victoria University. I graduated in 1996, which is a very long time ago indeed. What was that? It is, I'm very old. But also to be back in Wellington and to be able to talk about some of the stuff again in this place. So I thought that I would just talk for maybe half an hour about North Korea tonight, and then leave plenty of time for questions, and please ask anything you like, and happy to talk about China as well, where I've been based for the past 2 years if people want to talk about that. But first of all, let me give you a little background in that I was working for the Financial Times in London, and I'd always wanted to be a foreign correspondent, including during my time at Victoria. And I remember being a teenager growing up in Hastings and watching Cameron Bennett and Liam Giori and the Balkans in the 90s on TVNZ. I think you have to be of a certain age to understand what I'm talking about there. But I always wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and so I was in London working for the FT, and I got my big break, which is one day the Asia editor said to me, "How do you feel about Korea?" And I said, I'd love to go to Korea. I'd never been anywhere in Asia. I had never eaten kimchi. I learned how to say annyeonghaseyo on the plane on the way to Korea, but I knew that this was my big break, my big opportunity. What I didn't realize was that it was going to be the start of this kind of lifelong fascination, borderline obsession with North Korea. And so I was very lucky during those 4 years that I was based in Seoul, and that I got into Pyongyang 5 times, and I also crossed the border into the southern area of North Korea another 5 or 6 times during that period. And I think, partly it was I worked for a British newspaper, but I also think the fact that I was a New Zealander and the fact that we are considered to be a bit independent, or we're not quite the great Satan or the little Satan, that we are a bit more friendly, seen as more friendly. I think that really helped me a lot and was a key part of the reason why I was able to go in so many times. And so during those 4 years of going to North Korea, I saw how broken it was. North Korea had, Kim Jong Un was still the leader at that time. They had not long been out of this very devastating famine in the late 90s that killed maybe as many as 1 million people. And everything seemed very downtrodden. There was certainly no love for the regime. People were just muddling through, and the regime was just managing to keep a grip on the place. And I couldn't imagine for a second that this system, which should by rights have collapsed years before, maybe with the collapse of the Soviet Union during the metamorphosis of China, its other ally, but somehow they'd managed to hold on. But I just could not imagine to myself that they would be able to survive a transition into a third generation of the Kim regime. So this was my last trip during that period to North Korea was in 2008, the same year that Kim Jong Un, he went on to have a stroke, and that precipitated this process to try to train his third-born son, Kim Jong Un, to take over. And I went off and into the Middle East, into the US and things. And then the pull of North Korea, I guess, brought me back. In 2014, I joined the Washington Post and I was stationed in Tokyo. But the reason I came back was because I felt like I wasn't done with North Korea. And again, I was lucky. I got into North Korea in 2014. Again, I think helped by the fact that I'm a New Zealander. And I was astonished by what I saw, and that Pyongyang, which is the place where the regime allows journalists like me to go, it has always been a Potemkin village, and it remains that way, but even this Potemkin village had a facelift. It had looked better. And so there were now high-rise buildings in Pyongyang. It kind of looked like a third-rate Chinese city, and I mean that as a compliment in this situation. And that, they had the high-rise buildings. So nobody, usually when you think about, Central Park or something, everybody wants to live on the top floors, right? Because they have the best view. In North Korea, everybody wants to live 4th floor or below because there's not enough power to run the lift or to pump the water up. So you do not want to be in a 30th floor walk up with a great view over the Taedonggang River there. But so even just looking at Pyongyang at that time and seeing how much better it looked and how much more relaxed people seemed to be, I was really mystified and thinking, how has Kim Jong Un managed to do this? How has he managed to defy all of the expectations that this 27-year-old, completely unexperienced, chubby, in a country of skinny people, guy who had no military experience in a regime founded on a military-first policy, how had he managed to not just survive for 3 years by that stage, but almost he seemed to be thriving. So it really became to me a kind of personal inquiry project that I wanted to try to figure out Kim Jong Un as much as I could. So I set about trying to write a book about him. And I don't call it a biography because I think nobody can write a biography of Kim Jong Un. We still don't know enough about him. But I tried to pull together all of the pieces that I could find to try to paint a portrait of this man. So during the course of my reporting, I went back to Pyongyang one more time during that period in 2016, when Kim Jong Un convened the first Congress of the Workers' Party in Korea since 1980, in his lifetime. His father never did it. And that was really, I thought, the moment when he had solidified his leadership. He came out, he stood in front of a hall of 3,000 octogenarian generals and gave a commanding performance. He signaled that he was very much in control at that time. So I wanted to try to figure out how he had managed to do it. So I did this by trying to meet everybody who had ever met him, which at the beginning was relatively easy because there were so few of them. And I was living in Japan, so I met this very eccentric sushi chef who had worked in the royal compound while Kim Jong Un was a boy. And this just kind of shows you that the level of intelligence, like the CIA calls North Korea the hardest of the hard targets. But so the level of intelligence there is that this very eccentric Japanese sushi chef who left Japan in the booming 80s to move to North Korea was one of the key sources of information about this guy. And he painted a picture of a child who had this very dysfunctional childhood, came from this very abnormal family, where when he was 8 years old, he was introduced at his birthday party as the great successor, the future leader of North Korea. He was presented with a real little general's uniform, and real-life generals were bowing to him and saluting him. And I later met his aunt and uncle who had defected from the regime and now live in the United States. And they said that it was impossible for him from that moment on, from the age of 8, to live anything like a normal life. He had this extremely weird upbringing where he lived in this compound with his brother and his sister. He had no friends. He never went to school. He never even mingled with his half-siblings. There were a few of them. But his older half-brother, Kim Jong Un, they had no relationship whatsoever. So he had this very abnormal life. When he was 14 years old, he was sent to Switzerland. And Switzerland was chosen by the regime for a reason, because it's so famously discreet, and they knew that these children could have something approaching a normal life there. And he went to school at an English language school first of all, and then to a public German-speaking school. And again, it was an attempt to give him something like a normal life. But he didn't know how to function. He didn't know how to be with other children. He didn't know that you had to do your homework in order to get an A+. He was used to just, getting A+s regardless. So during the course of my reporting, I met the sushi chef. I tracked down his aunt and uncle who were living in the United States by that stage. I went to Switzerland and combed through the curriculum and learned about what kind of things he would have learned as a child, as a teenager in Switzerland, including, I thought very interestingly, all children in Switzerland learn about the French Revolution because it was part of Switzerland's own history. And I often wondered to myself, was Kim Jong Un paying attention during those classes? Does he remember what happens when rising expectations go unmet? I don't know. He may well have been drawing cartoons of Michael Jordan during that period. But I tracked down all these people to try to paint the portrait of him, and then trying to find people who had encountered him since he became leader after he returned to Pyongyang. And at the time when I was doing my reporting, there was really no encounter too trivial for me to hunt down that person. So I met some people in South Korea who'd been to Kim Jong-il's funeral and shaken his hand for 10 seconds and things. But still, I wanted to find out what insights they had by looking into his eyes for those 5 seconds or whatever. It was, there was so little information about him. But then as time went on, of course, suddenly in 2017, I was writing about him, and it was the year of fire and fury, of maximum pressure. Then all of a sudden in 2018, everything changed, and that he decided to go on a charm offensive. He had very let me just backtrack a second. I think, what a big part of the reason I wanted to write the book is because Kim Jong Un is treated as a joke in many parts of the world, partly because he looks like a cartoon character dictator. He's got the weird haircut and the funny outfits, and he's always like inspecting Hello Kitty bags and things like this. So I see, people do laugh at this cartoonish appearance of him, but during my time kind of studying him and learning about him, it really, I came to the conclusion that he's an extremely shrewd and calculating person. He has defied all of these expectations to be able to hold on to this regime for, it's now 8.5 years that he's been in power, well beyond all expectations, probably 8 years longer than anybody ever gave him, including very smart people in Washington, D.C., who thought that he would not be able to do it. And I think a big part of the way that he has been able to do this is by approaching his job of being a totalitarian dictator in a very rational and calculating way. First of all, in Korean studies, some of you know, people talk about the Beijing policy in North Korea, the two-track policy of Kim Jong Un was pursuing nuclear weapons and economic development at the same time. So this is a key part of his success so far, I think, that he pursued this two-track policy. But there's another, he doesn't call it a two-track policy, but I do, another two-track policy where he tried to instill fear into the population at the same time as engendering loyalty amongst the elites who could keep him in power. And so if I break that down a little bit, so he very shrewdly at the beginning realized for a 27-year-old guy to be able to take control of a military-first regime, he needed to prove his military credentials, and pouring all of his energy into the nuclear program was one way to do that, to prove that he was a strong leader, and to also placate the military who may have had misgivings about this young guy. And also something I think that is often overlooked about North Korea is that this is a great source of national pride for North Koreans inside the country. So when I've talked to defectors about the nuclear program, they all say, or many of them say, and one in particular sticks in my mind, and he was a science student in North Korea who was completely disgusted by this regime. He described to me how when he saw Kim Jong Un for the first time and realized that this regime was going to continue, that was the moment he knew he had to escape. But he said that when he learned in his physics class about nuclear fission and things, he was so proud that North Korea had been able to do this difficult thing that, crucially, Japan and South Korea had not been able to do. So this was a huge source of legitimacy inside North Korea for Kim Jong Un, I think. So there was a lot of doubt during the course of 2016-17 with all these missiles that failed. And again, he was kind of the laughing stock when they literally photoshopped a missile coming from a submarine. But Kim Jong Un was signaling his intent. A few months later, he really did launch a missile from a submarine, which was a major technological breakthrough. And then they really did detonate a hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon. He said that they were in the last phases of perfecting their intercontinental ballistic missile system. And sure enough, on July the 4th, no coincidence of the date, in 2017, he tested an ICBM that could reach the United States mainland. So Kim Jong Un very shrewdly set about proving that he was not to be underestimated on the military front. And even though he said in 2013 that he was going to pursue this two-track Beijing policy, it was very much front-loaded towards the nuclear program at the beginning. But as he made more progress on that, it's particularly at the end of 2017, he announced that he had completed his program, which to me was really the signal that he was ready to talk about the economy. and deal with the second track there. And sure enough, 2018, he sent his sister to South Korea to the Olympics, where she was smiling and charming and enigmatic, and was really the kind of best envoy, the smiling envoy of this totalitarian regime that could have been cast for the job. And she kicked off this process of diplomatic engagement, which we then saw very rapidly evolve over the course of 2018. And it's really striking to me to see how, and this is why I say that Kim Jong Un is very shrewd and calculating, how he played Donald Trump during this whole process. So, I mean, here he is. He is the young, inexperienced leader of this very small, broken down country in Northeast Asia, yet he managed to have summits with the leaders of China, South Korea, Russia. He had the Prime Minister of Japan almost begging for a summit, and then meet 3 times with Donald Trump, which is really no mean feat and was gold for his legitimacy drive within North Korea. And for him to be able to say to the people of North Korea, I am, your respected leader, not just in the propaganda at home, but look, here I am standing literally shoulder to shoulder with the leaders of all these responsible nuclear states. And he wanted to be seen as an international statesman and a leader of a nuclear-armed state like all the rest of them. So he embarked on this process, I think, because he wanted to tend to the economy. He wanted to try to get rid of the sanctions that had been imposed on North Korea as punishment for the nuclear and missile tests of 2016-17. He did not succeed in that. He held the summits. China suddenly had no more reason to impose sanctions or to adhere to maximum pressure as strongly as they had been during 2017. So I think he got a little bit of respite on the economic front, but he did not get rid of the sanctions. However, he suddenly had Donald Trump standing up there talking about his beautiful friendship with Kim Jong Un, explaining away all the human rights abuses in North Korea, saying, North Korea is a rough place, but there's a lot of rough places out there. He figured out how to play Donald Trump by sending him the huge envelopes. You'll remember that Donald Trump to this day brags about when people go into the Oval Office, he shows them the letters. He used very flowery, honorific language, and the translator made sure that Donald Trump knew that he was calling him Your Excellency and all these things. So while Kim Jong Un did not get the thing that he wanted, he still did manage to persuade Donald Trump that he was somebody who could be dealt with, that he did not need to be on the receiving end of any American attack. And I mean, if you have seen the astonishing news that came out overnight our time and the extract from John Bolton's book, we see that Donald Trump actually wanted to give Kim Jong Un a signed copy of Elton John's CD, Rocket Man, signed by Elton John, as a way to show to Kim Jong Un that it was meant as a compliment. Rocket Man was not derogatory in any way, but it was a gift to him. But apparently, saner minds in the US administration told Donald Trump that this was not a good idea. So I think he has been very tactical on this front in terms of nuclear weapons, economic development, both at the same time. I think right now he is coming under quite a lot of pressure because he has not gotten the sanctions relief that he wanted, but also the coronavirus is a big complication for Kim Jong Un because North Korea was the first country to close its borders. In January, they sealed that long border with China. They're paranoid at the best of times, but extremely concerned about a virus like this coming into North Korea, and their health system could certainly not cope with that. But the impact that this would have had on cross-border trade would be ginormous, and I think is really adding to the pressure on Kim Jong Un, and is probably responsible for a lot of what we're seeing in the past week or so. But before I get to that, so I talked about that's the two-track policy, but the other two-track way, and the reason why I think Kim Jong Un was able to consolidate his hold on this regime is by using fear as a very powerful tool. And so when we look at how he managed to get these octogenarian old guard around him, he very shrewdly again took advantage of the brains trust that his father left him. And even if you just look at the people who walked around the hearse at his father's funeral, there was the propaganda chief, the army chief, his uncle who was in charge of economic relations with China, and he took advantage of all of their knowledge, used that for as long as he needed it, and then one by one, all of those people have disappeared. Some, like the propaganda chief and the army chief, did just disappear, but his uncle was hauled out of a Politburo meeting very publicly, humiliated, denounced as a traitor for all ages in this very Shakespearean language. And then Kim Jong Un had bleachers set up, maybe similar to what you're sitting in now, and had these elites watch as he had his own uncle blown to smithereens with an anti-aircraft gun. So if you are a totalitarian dictator wanting to keep a hold on power, this is a very rational thing to do, because you can imagine that nobody is going to question you or put your hand up and doubt anything you say. This would have an extremely powerful deterrent effect on any naysayers in the regime, which I think was really planned by Kim Jong Un. And that's obviously a spectacular thing that he did to the elites at the top. But all down through the regime, we've seen Kim Jong Un keep in place the system of repression and the surveillance state that he inherited from his forebears. So to this day, North Korea practices a system of guilt by association, where anybody accused of a political crime, which could be questioning why the regime is spending all this money on nuclear weapons when people can't feed themselves properly still, not only would that critic be condemned to spend probably the rest of their lives in a labour camp, doing hard labour, working in a mine or something like that, but 3 generations of their family too. So that it's not just you who pays the price, it is your parents, your spouse, your children. And so when I have asked North Koreans who have escaped why there is no uprising, why there is no dissent, there's not even any graffiti in North Korea, why there is none of this, they all point to the system of repression. And one woman I talked to said, if you disagree with the system, you don't try to change it, you try to escape from it. And I think that is why Kim Jong Un has been able to defy the odds and keep in power, because he has proven to be very ruthless in how he will dispatch with any rivals for power and anybody who may question him. Also, in 2017, you'll remember that he, again, spectacularly had his brother smeared with a nerve agent in Kuala Lumpur airport. And, his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, died a very gruesome death. His organs shut down one by one within 20 minutes of that attack. And again, Kim Jong-un does this stuff with impunity. It's a chemical agent banned under international treaties. He had it done in full view of security cameras in an airport. But he suffered very little for this. And there is no question that he absolutely ordered this assassination of his brother. Nobody in North Korea would take on a job like this without the rubber stamp from the top. But I think he did it in such a spectacular way to send, again, the message, it doesn't matter who you are, you may be blood, you may be outside the country in full view of these cameras, but he will have his rivals or perceived rivals taken out in this way. So this is a message, I think, for some of the high-level defectors around the world who are criticising the regime, as well as any other family members who might think about doing the same thing. So this fear is a very potent tool, and one that Kim Jong Un has embraced wholeheartedly. Very contradictory to the initial expectations that because he went to school in Switzerland and because he's a millennial, that he would be more of a liberalizer or more open-minded than his forebears before him. I think probably his time in Switzerland proved to him that far from opening up and changing the system in any way, he absolutely had to keep it intact and keep it closed down, because without such a repressive totalitarian system, he'd be nobody. He would be just another kid going to school or having to work his way up in a meritocracy. So the flip side of that, this other track of that fear, is the loyalty. And that goes back to what I said when I started in that first trip I made back to Pyongyang under Kim Jong Un's tenure in 2014, and that he has really channeled so much effort into making the elites who live in Pyongyang and who keep his regime in power to feel like their lives have gotten better under him and that they have an interest in keeping him in power. So now there is this whole tier of North Korean oligarchs who are extremely corrupt, who are making loads of money through trading and bribery and sideline businesses on the side of their official jobs, who are living a much better standard of living, a much better life than they would have been 10 years ago, and than they would be if they were to escape to South Korea and try to set up a new life there. So he has not only used fear to keep them in line, but used created this sense of loyalty, so this new generation of millennials like him feel they have a future in his regime. So it's no coincidence that he walks around all these places with his glamorous wife next to him, which is like completely unprecedented in North Korea to have a public first lady, let alone one who was a famous singer and is, very stylish by North Korean standards, very risque, holding her husband's arm is like kind of scandalous in conventional conservative North Korean society. But I think, again, they've done that by design to create the sense that this is a modernizing monarchy. She's the Kate Middleton of North Korea, and he is going to lead North Korea into this new great era. So when I look at North Korea now, since I published my book last year, there have been a few ups and downs, and obviously things have not proceeded as Kim Jong Un wanted. But I think he still, when I look at him now, I see somebody who has been able to defy all the expectations and the odds and remain in power for much longer than anybody ever predicted. And there is no sign, or has been no sign until this year, that Kim Jong Un is going anywhere. That has changed over the past few months, but maybe I will finish there and open it up to questions and see, if you want to ask about that part, please do. But I welcome any questions about North Korea, China, any of it.
Okay. Just to, hog the stage, and I'm just going to kick off some of the questions.
Okay.
I've got one particular one, and it sort of relates to something that you said earlier around the numbers of people that do defect. And, I've been online to have a look at some of the figures for, I think in 2017, there were something like nearly 32,000 defectors who were registered in South Korea alone. What's your kind of sense of the real numbers, given that they could have gone to China, South Korea, Cambodia, or Laos? So, what's the sort of sense of the numbers that are really happening, leaving the country each year?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's 32,000 total since the 1980s. It's like the number of people who have escaped is I think there were more than that escaping from East Germany a year during the final years. So the number is very small, but also it's really plummeted under Kim Jong Un. So whereas in the early 2000s, like 2010, maybe there were 3,000 a year who were making it to South Korea. Now there's barely 1,000. And I think part of that is because Kim Jong Un has really cracked down on the border a lot, and it's much more difficult to escape now. People who do manage to escape, often they end up paying $10,000 to a broker to get them out of North Korea and into South Korea, which is an astronomical amount of money. And they're basically indentured to these brokers once they arrive in South Korea. So I think people have been stopped from leaving by the system, but also for many people, Kim Jong Un has eased up on regulation of markets, and there is now something of a private economy in North Korea, and there's markets that are flourishing and have been allowed to flourish because the state can't provide for the people anymore. So many people have, under their own steam, been able to work themselves to a slightly higher standard of living. So I think that, it's still extremely difficult outside of Pyongyang and even in Pyongyang for some people, but their need is not as great. So people, I remember meeting a family, I met them in Thailand. They'd escaped from North Korea 12 days before. And part of the reason that they escaped was because the schooling in their town was so terrible. The dad was a fisherman in a state-run company, was making loads of money smuggling back and forth between China and North Korea, but their son really liked art, and there was no art teacher at the school because the teacher never showed up because she was working in the market making money. And so just like South Koreans leave South Korea to get a better education for their families, so too now more North Koreans are leaving because they're disillusioned rather than because of economic reasons. So that's a long-winded way. So we don't know how many people are living and hiding in China because they are illegal there, and if they were found, they would be repatriated to North Korea and probably put into camps of some kind, into prison camps. So the estimates are usually about 100,000, but we just don't know. But there has definitely been a big drop-off under Kim Jong Un.
Okay. The second one that I wanted to ask was around Four Corners in Australia broadcast a series called Bureau 39, which is the bureau, the secret bureau that secures up to $1.6 billion for the Kim family for the nuclear program and for their sort of private uses. So when you were in North Korea, was any of that kind of evident to you, or were you kind of interested in exploring, where this money was coming from to fund the nuclear program?
Yeah, so that's the kind of reporting you don't do in North Korea. You do that outside of North Korea. So, yeah, I have, because that's one of the big mysteries, right? That even, there's been sanctions on North Korea for years and years, and these ones in 2016 were pretty much designed to cut off everything, like seafood, labour, all sources of foreign revenue. And yet we saw Kim Jong Un pull up to the summits with Trump and Pompeo in a brand new Mercedes Maybach, and then a Rolls Royce. So he's getting all of, not only is he getting the money for them, he's actually receiving these things despite the sanctions. So, yeah, it's a big mystery how they've been able to do that. I did meet one person from Office 39 who defected to the United States. And he described he was running a company in China, a state-run company, and they had targets that they had to meet. There were certain amounts of money, and he would be able to send back $10 million at a time, just in a briefcase on a boat across, sanctions be damned kind of thing. They would find ways of getting around the system. So I think we can pretty clearly see that sanctions have hurt the people of North Korea, but they haven't hurt the leadership of North Korea during that period. And one thing that is really puzzling is that during the 90s and the 2000s, there were so many reports of North Korean illicit activities. There were North Korean diplomats caught in Bulgaria with a boot full of heroin, and they were always caught with fake Marlboro cigarettes and super dollars and rhino horns and all this kind of stuff. We almost never hear of any of that stuff anymore, and I think that's because they've gotten a lot smarter. Cyber warfare is a huge tool for them. They stole $81 million from the Central Bank of Bangladesh before anybody even noticed, and have been behind many of the cyber attacks we've seen. So in many ways, that's the perfect North Korean crime, because no incontrovertible fingerprints. So they've gotten smarter, is what I'm saying.
So just following on from that, should the world really be quite concerned about the cyber kind of skills of North Korea? Is this really going to be quite a sort of significant issue for the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, it really is already. So when we look, there was that ransomware attack, WannaCry, a few years ago, which completely, it froze South Korea's financial system, but it also shut down the NHS in the UK for several days. So they can be extremely disruptive when they want to be. So yes, I think we should be concerned about it, but I'm not sure how much can be done.
Right. Yeah. And I guess, maybe one thing that's on everybody's minds, and then I'll open it up to everybody else, but the recent bombing of the liaison office.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to be the big consequence of that? Where's it going to lead?
So, this year we've hardly seen anything at all of Kim Jong Un compared to previous years. That could be social distancing. North Korea's health system can't cope with anything like that. That's a reasonable explanation, I think. But I also think it is quite reasonable to think that Kim Jong Un is sick. You don't need to be a medical doctor to look at him and see that he's in bad physical shape for a 36-year-old man. And when he's come out to the outside world, South Korean doctors have kind of measured him and counted his breaths and things, and they've said, he has a BMI, body mass index, of 45 or 46. He's severely obese, morbidly obese. The number of breaths he takes per minute, indicate he has lung issues. And, you look at him and you think, he's not a healthy man. So the idea, and I think the reason why the rumours in April took off, is because they seemed credible that he would have some kind of health issues. So I think we are seeing an effort to put his sister in the frame to be his successor, which even a few months ago I would have thought was completely impossible, because North Korea is such a patriarchal, chauvinistic society that the idea of a woman, let alone a young woman, taking over just seemed impossible. But by the same token, it also seemed impossible that she wouldn't take over, because this regime claims its legitimacy because of the bloodline, because they all descend from Kim Il-sung, and she is the only family member with any kind of position in the party and any kind of public profile. So, when I look at 2010, when Kim Jong Un was doing his apprenticeship to be the leader, he commanded an attack on a South Korean naval boat, which killed 46 sailors at that time, and is thought to have been Kim Jong Un proving his military credentials and that he was capable of doing tough things like that. So I think now we are seeing Kim Yo-jong, or the regime, showing that Kim Yo-jong can be hawkish, can be tough as well for those same reasons. So she has issued these very punchy statements about Moon Jae-in in the South, threatened. Again, they clearly telegraph what they're going to do. She threatened that something was coming, and sure enough, she blew up, and they do things like this on purpose because it's spectacular. There is the footage of this building going up, made for television, inshallah.
On behalf of everybody, can you please join with me in thanking
I can't let you go without a little plug, so I called into Unity Books, and they'll have my book in stock again next week if you're interested.
Thank you very much. Bottle of red. It was from our conference last year, but they're